The first tremor came at dawn, and Vareth felt it in his bones before the stone moved. He pressed one clawed hand against the corridor wall. The vibration was faint, a single pulse running through 300 meters of basalt, but it carried a frequency he had not felt in 400 years. Not geological, not mechanical, something breathing. He was already moving before the second pulse hit, his robes catching against the iron sconces as he descended the spiral passage toward the lower vaults. His staff struck each step with a hollow ring that echoed into the dark below. Vareth was old enough that the scales along his forearms had gone from deep bronze to weathered gray, cracked at the edges like dried riverbeds. Old enough that he remembered when the vaults of Ashenmere had last been opened not by curiosity, but by catastrophe. The third pulse stopped him at the landing of the seventh spiral. It was not a tremor, it was a heartbeat. Keeper Vareth. The voice crackled from the comm point embedded in the wall. Commander Tyrian Colony Garrison, we're reading seismic activity in the lower sectors. Your assessment. He lifted the comm handle. Seal the maintenance corridors between levels 4 and 9. No personnel below the third vault door. No exceptions. Is it structural? The engineers. It is not structural. He replaced the handle and continued his descent. The vaults of Ashenmere were older than the colony above them. Older than the species that had built the colony, older than the star charts that had first marked this world as habitable. They had been carved or grown, depending on which geological survey you trusted, into the basalt mantle of Ashenmere's northern plateau. 27 chambers arranged in a descending spiral, each one large enough to hold a frigate. Each one sealed with covenant iron and etched with draconic wards that Vareth himself had renewed every solstice for 212 years. Each one held a sleeper. The sleepers were the oldest beings in the known galaxy. True dragons, not the domesticated breeds that served as mounts on the frontier worlds, not the engineered worms that hauled ore in the Valeth system. These were the ancients, the firstborn, creatures whose wingspans had been measured in kilometers, and whose fire had carved the river canyons of 7 worlds. They had laid themselves down to rest when the younger species began to build, and the covenant had been formed around their slumber. Let them sleep, tend the vaults, maintain the wards, and pray they never wake. Vareth was the last of the keepers. His order had once numbered in the hundreds dragonkin bonded to the task by blood oath and scale mark. Now it was him. A weathered elder with aching joints, a staff that was more crutch than symbol, and a memory long enough to know what the heartbeat in the stone meant. Something in the deepest vault was stirring. He reached the 4th level before he found the first anomaly. The ward etchings on the iron door were glowing, not the steady amber of maintained energy, but a soft, pulsing blue, a color Vareth had only seen in the oldest manuscripts, described as the recognition glow. It meant the sleeper behind this door was not merely stirring, it was aware. He pressed his palm to the door. Through 3 inches of covenant iron he felt warmth. And something else, a sound so faint it was almost imagination. Singing. Vareth pulled his hand back as though burned. He stood very still, his tail coiled tight against his leg, and listened. The sound was distant, not coming from behind the door but filtering through the ventilation shafts that threaded the upper levels. A human voice, female, not performing, not broadcasting, humming. A simple melody, the kind of thing someone sings while working, unaware that anyone can hear. He checked the garrison logs on his wrist-mounted data slate. Level 3 maintenance corridors had been assigned to the colony's civilian support staff for the past 2 months, a temporary kitchen station serving the geological survey teams. The assignment had been approved by Commander Tyrian's office without keeper consultation. Vareth had not been informed because, as the footnote on the approval form noted, the keeper's purview does not extend to catering logistics. Vareth closed the data slate and climbed. He found the kitchen on level 3, wedged into a maintenance alcove that had been converted with fold-out tables, a portable heating unit, and stacked supply crates. The ventilation shaft that fed the alcove ran straight down through the rock, a direct channel to the lower vaults, unshielded by any ward. And standing at the heating unit, stirring a pot of something that smelled like grain broth and dried herbs, was a human woman. She was perhaps 50, perhaps older. It was difficult to tell with humans, whose aging seemed to happen in sudden increments rather than the slow mineral fade of dragonkin. Her hair was pulled back under a cloth wrap. Her hands were red from work, the knuckles swollen. She wore the plain gray tunic of a colony kitchen worker, stained at the front with broth and flour. A name patch on her shoulder read Maren. She was humming. The melody was nothing Vareth recognized, no liturgical significance, no harmonic pattern from any known tradition. It was simply a human tune, carried absent-mindedly, the way a person hums when the work is repetitive and the silence is too large. "You are Maren," he said from the doorway. She turned, startled. Her eyes went to his height first. He was tall even for dragonkin, his horned crest nearly brushing the alcove ceiling, then to his robes, then to the staff. She straightened. "Yes, sir, Sable Maren. Kitchen staff, rotation 4. Is something wrong with the food?" "How long have you been stationed here?" 8 weeks. They moved us down when the survey team started pulling double shifts in the lower tunnels. Closer to the work crews, quicker turnaround on meals." She paused. "Am I not supposed to be here?" Vareth looked at the ventilation grate in the ceiling. The shaft behind it dropped straight into the mountain. He could feel the warm air rising from below, the breath of the deep stone, carrying with it the faintest scent of sulfur and something older, something that smelled like the inside of a geode. "The singing," he said. "Do you always sing while you work?" Maren's expression shifted to something between embarrassment and defiance. "I hum. It's a habit. My mother did it, her mother before her. It's not loud. The survey crews never complained." "No," Vareth said, "they would not have." He moved to the ventilation grate and crouched beside it, pressing his ear to the metal. Through the shaft, he could hear the hum of the deep stone, and beneath it, the slow, rhythmic pulse that had woken him at dawn, the heartbeat of the sleeper on level 4. It was synchronized with the melody she had been humming. Vareth sat back on his haunches and looked at the human woman, who was watching him with the cautious patience of someone accustomed to being inspected by officials and found insufficient. "Maren," he said, "I need you to come with me." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Am I being reassigned?" "I need you to see something. Bring the broth." She stared at him. "The broth." "Bring it." The descent took 20 minutes. Vareth led, his staff marking each step, his free hand trailing along the wall to feel for changes in the stone's pulse. Maren followed, carrying a thermal container of grain broth, and wearing the expression of a woman who had been asked to do something inexplicable by someone whose authority she could not quite place. At the 4th level door, Vareth stopped. The ward etchings were still glowing blue, brighter now, pulsing in a rhythm that Maren might have recognized if she had been paying attention to it instead of to the growing warmth radiating through the stone around them. "What is this place?" she asked. "A vault," Vareth said. "One of 27. Each holds a sleeper, a dragon of the old world, the oldest living beings in the galaxy." He pressed his palm to the door again. The warmth was stronger now. "They have slept for 11,000 years. I was appointed to ensure they remained undisturbed." Maren looked at the door, then at the glowing etchings, then back at Vareth, and something disturbed them. "You did." The silence between them lasted 4 heartbeats, the sleeper's heartbeats, thrumming through the stone beneath their feet. "I don't understand," she said. Your voice carried through the ventilation shaft, down through unshielded stone, past every ward I have maintained for 2 centuries, into the chamber of the 4th sleeper, Urvithon, the Stone Mother. She has not stirred since the third covenant was sealed. He watched Marin's face. There was no comprehension yet, only the beginning of fear. She is not frightened. She is not angry. She is responding to you. Responding how? In answer, Vareth placed both palms on the iron door and spoke a word in Draconic, a ward key, one of 30 he carried in memory, each one a weight he had borne alone since the last keeper before him had died. The door's etchings flared from blue to gold, and the iron began to move. The vault beyond was vast. The ceiling was lost in shadow, but the walls caught light bioluminescent veins of mineral running through the basalt like frozen lightning, casting the chamber in pale green and amber. The air was warm, humid, tasting of deep earth and something alive. And in the center of the chamber, coiled upon herself like a mountain range folded into repose, was Urvithan. She was immense. Her scales were the color of old iron, shot through with veins of glowing amber that pulsed in time with the heartbeat Vareth had felt through the stone. Her wings were folded against her flanks, each one large enough to shadow a city block. Her head rested on her forelimbs, and her eyes, each one the size of a shuttle viewport, were half open, watching the doorway with a slow, ancient awareness that made the air itself feel heavier. Marin stopped breathing. Vareth waited. He had seen this reaction before, centuries ago, when he was young and had entered the vaults for the first time. The weight of a sleeper's presence was not something the mind could process immediately. It was too large, too old, too fundamental, like standing at the base of a glacier, and understanding for the first time that it was moving. "She knows you are here," Vareth said quietly. Urvithan's nostrils flared. The exhale was a warm wind that stirred Marin's hair and carried the scent of deep stone and ancient fire. One enormous eye shifted, the pupil contracting from a vertical slit to something rounder, softer, a change Vareth recognized from the manuscripts as the recognition dilation. The eye that watched for threat was not the same shape as the eye that watched with interest. Marin took a step forward. Vareth almost stopped her. Every instinct in his keeper training screamed at the breach of protocol, but something held him. The human woman was not approaching the way a supplicant would. She was not kneeling, not prostrating, not performing any of the gestures that the old rites prescribed for addressing an ancient. She was walking toward the dragon the way she would walk toward a pot that needed checking. "She's warm," Marin said, not to Vareth. Her voice was soft, practical. She set the thermal container down on the stone floor and looked up at the vast head resting on forelimbs that were thicker than the colony's main support columns. Urvithan's jaw opened a fraction of an inch. A sound came out, not a growl, not a roar. It was low, resonant, and it vibrated in Vareth's chest like a struck bell. He had never heard a sleeper vocalize. In 212 years, he had never heard one of them make a sound. But Marin had, or something close enough. "That sounds like you're hungry," she said. She opened the thermal container. Steam rose into the vault's warm air, carrying the plain scent of grain broth and herbs, a smell so mundane, so profoundly ordinary against the backdrop of an 11,000-year-old dragon the size of a geological formation, that Vareth felt something crack in his chest that he had not known was rigid. Marin poured a measure of broth into the containers, lit a cup, at most, and held it up, not offering it to the dragon's mouth, because the mouth was 10 meters above her. She held it the way someone holds a cup of tea toward a friend. "It's not much," she said, "but it's hot." The air in the vault shifted. Urvithan's head lowered slowly, with the careful precision of something that understood its own vastness and chose, deliberately, to be gentle. The head came down until one enormous eye was level with Marin's face, close enough that the human woman could have touched the lid of that eye with her outstretched hand. The pupil was round, fully round, the recognition dilation. A sound came from the dragon's throat. Not a word. Vareth did not believe the ancients used words, but a tone, a frequency, a vibration that settled into his bones and his blood and his scale marks, and said something that his keeper training translated before his conscious mind could catch up. Safe bringer. Vareth's knees gave. Not from weakness, from recognition. He had spent 2 centuries maintaining wards, renewing seals, monitoring instruments, cataloging tremors, and writing reports that no one read. He had done it alone, in silence, because the Covenant demanded it, and because the alternative, the sleepers waking in rage, in confusion, in the blind fire of beings older than civilization, was unthinkable. And here was this human woman, holding a cup of soup toward a god, and the god was calling her safe. He pulled himself back to standing. His staff had fallen. He retrieved it and leaned on it, breathing. "Marin," he said. His voice was unsteady, and he did not care. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth. Have you been leaving anything near the ventilation shafts? Food, water, anything?" She looked at him with the expression of someone caught doing something kind. "Sometimes, in the evenings after the crews were done, I noticed the grate got warmer than the rest of the corridor. I thought maybe there was a heating line underneath. I'd leave a bowl of broth on the grate, something warm for the heat, if that makes sense." She paused. "The bowls were always empty in the morning. I thought it was the survey crews." It was not the survey crews. Vareth could see it now, the faint discoloration on the vault floor below the ventilation shaft, where broth had dripped through the grate and pooled on the stone, where Urvithan had tasted it, where the first thread of awareness had been woven not by ward or ritual or the accumulated knowledge of the keeper order, but by a human woman's habit of leaving warm food for whatever warmth she found. "I need to go deeper," Vareth said. "I need to check the other vaults." "How many are there?" 27, and if the 4th sleeper is aware, others may be waking. "Because of me. Because of what you did, not just the singing, though that carried far, the kindness, the warmth. These beings have slept through wars, through extinctions, through the collapse and rebuilding of civilizations. They did not stir. But you left soup on a grate, and you hummed while you worked, and something that has been sleeping for 11 millennia opened its eyes." Marin looked back at Urvithan. The dragon had not moved, her head still rested near the floor, one great eye watching the human with an expression that Vareth could only describe as tender. It was a word he had never applied to an ancient before. It did not fit in his training, in his protocols, in his understanding of what these beings were. But it was accurate. "Do you want me to stop?" Marin asked. "The singing, the food, should I stop?" Vareth considered the question. The correct answer by Covenant protocol was yes. Seal the ventilation shafts, relocate the kitchen station, reinforce the wards, file the incident report, and resume the silence. The sleepers were to remain undisturbed. That was the Covenant. That was his purpose. But Urvithan's eye was round, and her voice had said safe bringer, and in 212 years of solitary vigil, Vareth had never once felt the thing he was feeling now, which was the sudden, vertiginous suspicion that the Covenant might have been wrong. "No," he said, "I want you to come with me all the way down." The descent to the lower vaults took the rest of the day. Vareth moved slowly, his joints protested, and the deeper passages had not been walked in decades. Marin walked beside him, carrying her thermal container, asking questions that no one had ever asked him. "How do you renew the wards?" "By hand. Each etching is retraced with a stylus dipped in mineral solution. 27 doors 4 times a year." "Alone?" "The last keeper before me died 73 years ago. There was no replacement. The Covenant assigned the post to whoever remained." "That's you." "That is me." She was quiet for a while. They passed the 5th vault door, which was cold and dark, the sleeper inside still deep in its millennia of rest. The 6th was the same. At the 7th, Vareth paused. The ward etchings showed the faintest trace of blue. "This one feels different," Marin said, pressing her hand to the stone beside the door. Not warm, but listening. Veyrath opened the seventh door. The sleeper inside was smaller than Urvithon, still enormous by any standard, but shaped differently. Its scales were a deep twilight blue, cracked and weathered, and its wings were partially unfurled, spread across the vault floor like fallen sails. Its breathing was audible, a slow, rasping rhythm that spoke of age beyond comprehension. This was Threnval, the Dusk Walker, and he was the oldest of the Ashenmere sleepers. His eyes were open. Not half open, not the slow lid lift of waking awareness. Fully open, both of them, the amber irises fixed on the doorway with an intensity that made Veyrath's scale marks burn. And then Threnval did something that no sleeper had done in the recorded history of the Covenant. He spoke. The word was not in Draconic. It was not in any language Veyrath knew. It was a sound that bypassed language entirely, a tone that entered through the chest and settled in the marrow, and what it carried was a question. Not hostile, not demanding, curious. Who brings warmth? Maren stepped past Veyrath. He let her. He did not know why he let her, except that something in the way Threnval had asked the question made him understand that the answer was not his to give. She knelt on the vault floor. Not in supplication, she knelt the way someone kneels to check on a child who has fallen. She looked up at the vast, weathered head, at the eyes that were older than the stone around them, and she said, "I'm Sable. I brought soup. Would you like some?" The sound that came from Threnval was the second word Veyrath had ever heard a sleeper speak. It was simpler than the first, and it carried no question. Yes. She poured broth into the container lid. She held it up, and Threnval lowered his great, cracked head slowly, as Urvithon had, with that same devastating gentleness, and breathed in the steam. Veyrath watched from the doorway. His staff was shaking in his grip, not from cold, not from fear, but from something he did not have a word for in Draconic. The closest translation in the human language he had learned decades ago, reading their literature in the long silence of his quarters, was awe, but the human word was too small. What he felt was the recognition that everything he had believed about his purpose, the silence, the isolation, the wards maintained in solitude, the Covenant's insistence that the sleepers must never be disturbed, had been built on a misunderstanding so profound that it remade the world around him as he stood in it. The sleepers had not wanted silence. They had wanted someone to come. They pressed deeper. Veyrath opened vault after vault as the hours passed, and the light above them faded to something he could only track by his data slate's clock. At the ninth vault, the sleeper was still dormant, vast, dark, its breathing so slow that Veyrath could count 30 seconds between each rise of its ribcage. The ward etchings held steady amber. But when Maren stepped inside the doorway and said simply, "Hello," the amber flickered. Just once. A single blue pulse that ran the length of the door frame and then faded. "Did I do that?" Maren asked. "You did," Veyrath said. He watched the etchings settle back to amber and felt something shift in his understanding of the wards he had maintained for 2 centuries. They were not locks. They were thresholds, and the sleepers had been waiting on the other side. The 10th vault was different. Veyrath felt the wrongness before the door was fully open, a dry heat that hit his face like a blast furnace, carrying the acrid scent of scorched stone. The bioluminescent veins in this chamber had gone dark. The only light came from the sleeper itself, a dragon whose scales were deep crimson, veined with lines of molten gold that pulsed rapidly, unevenly. Its head was raised off the ground. Its eyes were open. The pupils were vertical slits, the threat configuration. "Stay back," Veyrath said, extending his staff across the doorway. His hearts were hammering. This was what the Covenant had feared. This was the fire waking, the rage rise, the scenario that had justified 11,000 years of sealed silence. The Crimson Sleeper's jaw opened. Heat rippled in the air above its teeth, not flame, but the warning that flame was possible. A low vibration filled the chamber, pitched below hearing, felt in the gut. Veyrath's scale marks burned in a way that triggered his deepest keeper instinct. Retreat, seal, reinforce. Close the door, he said. Wait, Marin's hand was on his arm. Her grip was firm, the grip of a woman who had spent decades hauling stock pots and supply crates. Look at its breathing. Veyrath looked. The crimson dragon's breathing was rapid, shallow, not the deliberate rhythm of aggression. It was panting. The heat radiating from its scales was not directed outward. It was pouring off the dragon the way fever heat pours off a sick body. It's not angry, Marin said. It's frightened. Marin, this is a fire-class ancient. If it flames in this enclosed space, then it would have done it already. She pushed past his staff. Veyrath grabbed for her arm and missed. She walked into the chamber. The heat pressed against her like a wall. Veyrath could see sweat breaking out across her face, darkening the collar of her tunic. The crimson dragon's head swiveled toward her, and the threat-slit pupils contracted tighter. Marin stopped. She was 15 meters from the dragon's head, standing on stone that was hot enough to feel through her boots. She did not raise her hands. She did not back away. She stood the way she stood at her kitchen station, feet planted, shoulders set, weight balanced for the long hours of work. I know, she said. Her voice was quiet, steady. Waking up is hard, everything's different, everything's loud, but you're not alone in it. The crimson dragon's jaw closed. The heat in the air dropped by a fraction. The panting slowed. Marin took one step forward, then another. She was close enough now to feel the dragon's breath on her face, still hot, still carrying the scorched stone scent, but steadier. The gold veins in its scales pulsed less erratically. She reached up and placed her palm flat against the dragon's jaw. The scales were hot, not burning, not quite, but close. She held her hand there. The dragon flinched. Then slowly, the enormous head tilted into her touch. The threat-slit pupils expanded. Not to full round, not yet, but enough. Enough that Veyrath, standing in the doorway with his staff braced against the frame and his knees threatening to give way for the second time that day, could see the shift from fear to something else. Recognition. The crimson dragon exhaled. The breath was warm instead of scorching. The gold veins dimmed to a gentle pulse, synchronized with the heartbeat in the stone. And the sound that came from the ancient's throat was not a word but a feeling, transmitted through vibration. Alone, so long alone. Marin pressed her other hand to the dragon's jaw. Not anymore, she said. Veyrath leaned his forehead against the door frame and breathed. His hands were shaking. In 212 years of keeper service, he had never opened the sealed emergency protocol. He had never needed to. And now, watching a kitchen worker calm a fire-class ancient with her bare hands and the steadiness of someone who had spent a lifetime showing up for the work, he understood that the emergency protocol had always been pointed in the wrong direction. The threat had never been the sleepers. The threat had been the loneliness. They continued down. At the 12th vault, the sleeper Kaelindra, a dragon whose scales were the pale gold of old parchment, her wings torn and scarred from some conflict that predated the Covenant, was already vocalizing when they arrived. A low, sustained note that resonated through the corridor and made the iron fittings vibrate. Marin paused. That sounds like she's in pain. I do not know, Veyrath said, because he did not. Marin went in. She did not bring the broth this time. The container was nearly empty. She brought herself. She walked to the base of Kaelindra's head and placed her hand on the dragon's jaw, on the cracked and faded scales, and the vocalization changed. The sustained note softened, dropped in pitch, and became something that Veyrath's keeper training had no category for. A purring. A dragon the size of a small mountain was purring, because a human woman had touched her face. She's cold, Marin said. She looked back at Veyrath. Can we do something about that? Veyrath opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I will see what can be arranged. At the 14th vault, a sleeper with mottled silver-green scales and a body that stretched the entire length of the chamber, its tail curled against the far wall. Its head near the door, opened one eye when Marin entered and made a sound like tectonic plates settling. Marin poured the last half-cup of broth and held it up. The dragon's tongue, long, dark, forked, extended with a delicacy that seemed impossible for something that size, and lifted the broth from the cup without disturbing it. "Good manners," Marin said, and the dragon's eye crinkled at the corners. Vareth had no framework for an ancient dragon's eye crinkling. He filed the observation under a new category he was building in his head, one that had no equivalent in the Covenant archives: things the sleepers do when someone is kind to them. By the time they reached the 17th vault, Vareth had stopped trying to maintain professional distance. 8 of the 27 sleepers were awake, eyes open, wardetchings glowing blue, the recognition dilation visible in every pupil that watched Marin cross the threshold. He sat on the vault floor beside Marin while she portioned the dregs of her broth between 2 ancient dragons who had lowered their heads to the ground, and were watching her with expressions that transcended species, that transcended the 11,000 years of silence, that transcended everything Vareth had been taught about the nature of these beings. "Why do you think they respond to you?" he asked. Marin shrugged. "I don't think it's me specifically. I think it's the doing of the thing, the warmth, the food, the sound of someone working nearby who isn't afraid of them." She rubbed her swollen knuckles. "My grandmother used to say that the loneliest sound in the world isn't silence. It's the sound of someone who could talk to you choosing not to." Vareth looked at his hands, at the gray, cracked scales, at the ward marks he had maintained in solitude for 212 years, in silence, following a covenant that had prescribed distance as the only safe posture toward the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "We chose not to," he said. "My order, we chose silence because we feared what waking them would bring. Fire, destruction, the old stories." "And what did it bring?" He looked at the 2 ancients, their vast heads resting on the stone, their eyes soft and round and fixed on the human woman who had brought them soup. "This," he said. The comm unit on his wrist crackled. Commander Tyrian's voice, urgent. "Keeper Vareth, we are reading seismic signatures from 17 of the 27 vault chambers." "What is happening down there?" Vareth lifted the comm. "The sleepers are waking." A long silence. "Then, should we evacuate?" Vareth looked at Marin. She was humming again the same simple melody, quiet, absent-minded, the sound of someone who did not realize she was being heard by beings older than the stars above them. "No," Vareth said. "Send down blankets and more soup." The word spread through the colony, then the garrison, then the orbital station, then outward along the communication relays faster than Vareth could track. The first crisis arrived before the delegation. Vareth was on level 6 when his comm unit screamed with Commander Tyrian's voice, stripped of composure. "Keeper, we are initiating the Ashfall Protocol. The colony engineers are preparing to flood the ventilation system with inert gas and reseal the vault corridors. We cannot have 17 of those things awake under a civilian population." Vareth stopped walking. "Commander, I strongly advise." "This is not a request. The Ashfall Protocol was designed for exactly this scenario. The colony charter gives garrison command authority to seal the vaults in the event of a hostile waking. These are not hostile." "You cannot guarantee that." A sound rolled through the stone beneath their feet, not a tremor, a vocalization deep, resonant, coming from multiple chambers at once, 17 sleepers awake and listening. The stone walls vibrated, and the iron sconces rang like tuning forks, and Vareth understood with a cold certainty that if Commander Tyrian flooded those chambers with inert gas, the sleepers would interpret it as an attack. Not because they were hostile, because they had just learned what kindness felt like, and anything that followed which was not kindness would read as betrayal. "Commander," Verath said, keeping his voice level, "if you execute Ashfall, you will not put them back to sleep. You will give them a reason to be what you fear." Silence on the comm. "You have one keeper left," Verath continued. "One, and I am telling you that the situation is stable. The sleepers are calm. They are responding to a single human being with no weapons, no wardcraft, and no authority beyond the fact that she left warm food where warmth was needed. If you seal the vaults, you take that from them. And I do not know what happens after that." The comm crackled. Tyrion's voice came back, strained. "You have 24 hours, Keeper. Then the council delegation arrives and they will make the call." "Understood." Verath lowered the comm. His hand was steady, but his tail was coiled so tight against his leg that the scales ached. He looked at Marin, who had heard the entire exchange, and was watching him with the particular calm of someone who has spent decades dealing with management decisions made by people who have never set foot in the kitchen. 24 hours, she said. "Yes." "Then we'd better keep going." She picked up the thermal container. "I'll need to make more broth." She climbed back to level 3, alone, while Verath kept vigil in the vaults. He moved from chamber to chamber, monitoring the sleepers, speaking the ward keys to check each seal. In every waking vault the pattern held, round pupils, gentle breathing, the recognition glow steady on the doors. In Vault 10, the Crimson Dragon, the one that had frightened him, was sleeping. True sleep, not dormancy. Its gold veins pulsed slowly, evenly. The scorched stone around its body had cooled. Marin returned 2 hours later with a fresh container and a canvas sack over her shoulder. She had raided the garrison supply depot. "I told them it was for the survey crews," she said, pulling blankets from the sack. "They didn't ask questions." "You lied to the garrison quartermaster." "I requisitioned supplies for individuals under my care. The paperwork is technically accurate." Verath looked at her. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed. It was a dry, rusty sound, like a machine starting after years of disuse, and it echoed in the corridor in a way that made the ward etchings on the nearest door pulse blue. By the following morning, the first delegation arrived, 3 dragonkin from the Covenant Council, elders whose scale marks burned with authority and whose expressions burned with alarm. They came to Vault 4. Verath met them at the door. "Keeper," the lead council elder said. Her name was Serathine, and she was the highest-ranking dragonkin in the sector. Her scales were deep sapphire, her crest high and sharp, her bearing the precise opposite of everything Marin embodied. "You will explain how 17 sealed ancients have moved from dormancy to active awareness in under 2 days." "I will," Verath said, "but you need to see it yourself." He opened the door. Serathine and her delegation stepped into the vault of Urvithon. Marin was already there. She had returned that morning with a fresh batch of broth, 3 blankets she had requisitioned from the garrison supply depot, and a small portable heating unit she had carried down 7 levels of spiral staircase. She had set up the heating unit near Urvithon's head. She had draped one of the blankets over a section of the dragon's forearm where the scales were thin and cracked. "She gets cold there," Marin had told Verath, matter-of-factly, as though tending to the comfort of an 11,000-year-old god were a line item on her kitchen rotation. When Serathine entered, Marin was sitting cross-legged on the vault floor, her back against Urvithon's jaw, humming while she mended a tear in one of the blankets. The dragon's eye was half-closed, the pupil round, the massive body settled into a posture that Verath now recognized from the oldest manuscripts, from illustrations he had dismissed as symbolic as contentment. Serathine stopped walking. Her delegation stopped behind her. "What is this?" Serathine whispered. "This is Sable Marin," Verath said. "Kitchen staff, rotation 4. She has been feeding and singing to the sleepers through the ventilation shafts for 8 weeks. They recognized her before I did." "That is a human." "Yes." She is sitting against the stone mother's jaw. Yes, the stone mother permits this. Urvathan's eye opened. The pupil contracted, shifted to the delegation, assessed them with 11,000 years of accumulated judgment, and then deliberately, unmistakably, the eye shifted back to Marin. The dragon exhaled. The breath was warm, and it stirred the fabric of the blanket Marin was mending, and the human woman reached up without looking and patted the dragon's jaw the way someone pats a dog's head when they sneeze. Sarathine's crest lowered. Vareth had never seen a council elder's crest lower involuntarily. It was a reflex, an ancient dragonkin response to the presence of something sacred. She is not one of ours, Sarathine whispered. She is not bonded, she is not marked. She has no ward knowledge, no covenant authority, no. No, Vareth said, she has soup. The council delegation stayed for 3 days. On the first day, they observed from a distance. On the second day, Sarathine asked to enter a vault alone with Vareth. He brought her to Vault 7 Threnval, the Dusk Walker. The ancient dragon's eyes tracked Sarathine as she entered. The pupils held steady, not the round softness he showed Marin, but not the threat-slit either. Something between. Assessment. Sarathine stood at the center of the chamber and performed the formal address of the covenant, a sequence of postures and spoken phrases that had been codified 11,000 years ago. The ritual any keeper or council member was trained to use in the presence of an awakened ancient. Threnval watched the entire ritual without moving. When it was done, his jaw opened, and a single tone filled the chamber, not hostile, not warm, neutral, the draconic equivalent of acknowledgement without welcome. Then Marin walked in behind them with a container of broth. Sorry, I'm late. The heating element on level 3 gave out again. I had to use the backup. She crossed the chamber, set the container down, and poured a cup. She held it up toward Threnval the way she always did. The dragon's pupils dilated to full round. The neutral tone in his throat shifted, warmed, deepened into the resonance that Vareth now recognized instantly. Safe bringer. Threnval lowered his head to the ground, positioning one eye at Marin's level, and breathed in the steam from the cup. Sarathine watched this happen. Her clawed hands, clasped behind her back in the formal posture, slowly unclenched. I performed the full rite, she said to Vareth very quietly. He was polite. She brought soup. He was transformed. Yes, Vareth said. This is not something we taught. No, this is something humans do. On the third day, they visited every waking vault. They watched Marin work carrying broth, adjusting blankets, talking to the sleepers in a plain, conversational tone that treated 11,000-year-old dragons the way she would treat regulars at a lunch counter. In one vault, a sleeper with iridescent pearl scales and a head shaped like a crested helm responded to Marin's humming by tilting its head and producing a harmonic, a second note, pitched to complement hers. Marin stopped, startled, then adjusted her melody to match, and for 30 seconds the vault filled with a duet between a human kitchen worker and a being old enough to remember when the stars above Ashenmere were young. Vareth recorded it on his data slate. He had never used the audio function before. He did not know why he was saving it, except that it felt like evidence of something the galaxy needed to know. In the 19th vault, she found a sleeper whose wing was bent at an angle that suggested an ancient injury, frozen into place by millennia of stillness. She asked Vareth if anyone had ever tried to help with it. He said no, the covenant forbade contact. Marin looked at the wing, then at Vareth, then at the wing again. She climbed the dragon's foreleg carefully, slowly, one handhold at a time on the ridges of its scales until she reached the joint. She examined it, prodding gently. The dragon watched her with both eyes, its breathing quickened but steady. It's not broken, she said from 20 feet above the vault floor. It's just stiff, locked up. Like a shoulder that hasn't moved in too long. She began to work the joint with her hands, pressing and kneading and leveraging her whole body weight into it. The dragon made a sound, a deep, grinding vocalization that could have been pain or relief or something for which no language had a word. The wing moved, an inch, then two. Then, with a sound like a sail catching wind, it unfurled, spreading across the vault in a span that brushed both walls, sending dust and debris cascading from surfaces that had not been disturbed since before recorded history. The dragon's vocalization changed. What came out was unmistakable in any language, any species, any frame of reference. Joy. Vareth was weeping. He did not bother to hide it. Seraphine was weeping beside him. Two of the delegation members had left the vault because they could not bear the weight of what they were witnessing. In the corridor afterward, Seraphine stopped walking. She placed one hand against the stone wall and stood still for a long time. "I have served the Covenant for 340 years, she said. "I have read every manuscript, memorized every protocol, renewed the wards on 6 vault systems across 4 worlds. I believed I understood these beings." "So did I," Vareth said. "We understood nothing. We understood our own fear and called it knowledge." On the final evening, Seraphine convened a formal session in the corridor outside the 4th vault. All 3 delegation members attended. Vareth attended. Marin was not invited. She was in Vault 12, singing Kalindra to sleep. "The Covenant is clear," Seraphine said. Her voice was steady, but her crest was still lowered. "The sleepers are to remain undisturbed. This human has violated every protocol we possess." "She violated nothing," Vareth said. "She was never informed of the protocols. She was assigned to a kitchen station above an unshielded ventilation shaft, and she did what humans do. She worked. She hummed. She left food for whatever was warm." The Covenant assumed the sleepers would wake in rage, that they would burn, that they would rise and consume the worlds they once shaped. Vareth's voice was rough but unbroken. 11,000 years we have maintained that assumption. And in 8 weeks, a woman with a pot of grain broth proved it wrong. Not with force, not with wardcraft, with soup, with a lullaby, with the extraordinary human capacity to encounter something ancient and terrifying and respond to it with a bowl of something warm. Seraphine was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What are you proposing?" "I am not proposing anything. I am telling you what has already happened. The sleepers are awake. They are calm. They are content. And they are responding to a human being who does not know she is significant. That is the fact. The Covenant can either adapt to it or try to put 17 ancient dragons back to sleep against their will. I do not recommend the second option." "And the human?" "Her name is Sable Marin. She is a kitchen worker. She would like to know if the garrison can spare more blankets." The vote was held the next morning. Seraphine cast the deciding ballot herself. Vareth found Marin in Vault 4, sitting in her usual spot against Urvathan's jaw. The dragon was sleeping, truly sleeping now. Not the deep dormancy of the Covenant seal, but the natural sleep of a living creature, breathing slowly, warmth radiating from her scales, the ward etchings on the door glowing a steady, peaceful gold. "The council has made a decision," Vareth said. Marin looked up from the blanket she was mending. "Am I being relocated?" "No, you are being recognized." He paused because the words were difficult, not because they were hard to say, but because they were too large for the corridor. "The council has dissolved the silence provision of the Covenant. The sleepers are to be tended, not sealed. A new post has been created, Warden of the Waking Vaults." "That sounds important." "It is the highest honor the Covenant has ever bestowed on a non-dragonkin." Marin frowned. "I'm a kitchen worker." "Yes," Vareth said, "that is precisely the point." He sat down beside her, his back against the warm stone of the vault wall, close enough to Urvathan's jaw that he could feel the dragon's breath on his face. He had not sat this close to a sleeper in 212 years of keeping the vaults. He had not known it was allowed. "What does the job involve?" Marin asked. "What you have been doing, feeding them, singing, being present, being warm." He paused. "And you will need more blankets." Marin laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, and it echoed in the vault, and Urvathan's eye opened at the sound, the pupil round and soft, and the dragon's tail, a structure the size of a river barge, shifted on the vault floor until its tip rested against Marin's knee. Vareth looked at the human woman and the dragon, at the cup of broth and the mended blanket and the portable heater, at the 11,000-year-old being who had chosen, upon waking from a sleep longer than most civilizations, to rest her head beside a human who smelled like grain broth and sang off-key. He thought about what the Covenant had gotten wrong, not out of malice, but out of the kind of fear that calcifies into procedure. They had looked at the ancients and seen power, fire that could reshape continents, bodies that could crush cities, lifespans that dwarfed civilizations. They had built the Covenant around containment, around silence, around the assumption that the safest relationship with something that powerful was no relationship at all. And the sleepers had accepted it. For 11,000 years they had accepted the silence, not because they agreed, not because they did not feel the loneliness, but because no one had offered them anything else. Until a woman with swollen knuckles and a pot of grain broth left a warm bowl on a grate, and hummed because the silence was too large. On the morning Sarathine departed, the full delegation assembled at the main vault entrance. Vareth stood at the threshold, Marin beside him, still in her kitchen tunic, still carrying a thermal container. Commander Tyrion was there too. He had come down for the first time, standing at the back of the group with the carefully neutral expression of a military officer who had been proven wrong and was deciding how to feel about it. Sarathine turned to face the vaults one last time. The stone beneath their feet thrummed not with alarm, not with tremor, but with the collected heartbeats of 17 ancient dragons, awake and calm, their breathing synchronized into a rhythm that Vareth now recognized as the oldest sound in the galaxy. "Commander Tyrion," Sarathine said without looking back. "Council Elder, the Ashfall Protocol is to be stricken from the colony's emergency procedures, permanently." "Understood." "And the kitchen station on level 3 is to be expanded. Whatever resources Warden Marin requires, heating units, supplies, blankets, additional staff when available, are to be provided without requisition delay." Tyrion's neutral expression cracked slightly. "Warden Marin, you have been speaking with a woman who has just been appointed to the highest position the Covenant has created in 6,000 years. Sarathine's voice carried the dry weight of someone accustomed to delivering rank adjustments. "You will update your records." Tyrion looked at Marin. She was holding her thermal container and looking like she wanted to ask about the blanket situation again. "Yes, Council Elder," Tyrion said. Sarathine lowered her crest, not the involuntary dip of awe she had shown in the vault, but a deliberate, formal bow, the deepest gesture of reverence a dragonkin elder could offer. It was directed at Marin. The two delegation members followed, their crests lowered, their heads dipped. And then from the depths of the vaults, from 17 chambers carved into stone older than starlight, a sound rose. Not a roar, not a cry. A tone deep, resonant, harmonized across 17 ancient voices, vibrating through the basalt and the iron and the bones of everyone standing at the threshold. "Safe bringer, safe bringer, safe bringer." The sound rolled through the corridors and up through the spiral passages and into the colony above, where workers stopped mid-task and looked at the floor because the stone beneath their feet was singing. It reached the garrison command center, where instruments registered the vibration as a harmonic pattern too regular to be geological and too ancient to be mechanical. It reached the orbital station, where a signals officer recorded it and flagged it as an anomaly of unknown origin, noting in the margin of her report that it sounded to her like gratitude. Vareth's knees buckled again. This time he did not try to stand. He knelt on the stone floor, one hand on his staff, the other pressed flat against the ground where the vibration was strongest, and he let the sound wash through him. 212 years of solitary vigil, of maintaining silence around beings who had wanted only to be spoken to. 212 years of tending wards that were not locks but invitations, kept sealed by a covenant too afraid to accept what lay on the other side. The sound said, "We forgive you." The sound said, "You were afraid and now you are here and that is enough." Maren stood. She did not kneel because she did not understand the significance of the sound. She stood with her thermal container in one hand and her other hand resting lightly on Vareth's shoulder, steadying him, because he seemed unsteady, and that was the kind of thing she noticed. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked up at her. At the gray kitchen tunic and the swollen knuckles and the cloth-wrapped hair, and the face of a human woman who had done nothing extraordinary by her own measure, who had simply worked, and hummed, and left warm food where warmth was needed, and who had, in doing so, woken the oldest sleeping gods in the galaxy and been named holy by them. "Yes," Vareth said, "I believe I am." He got to his feet. His joints ached, and his staff was heavier than it had been that morning, and he was tired in a way that went deeper than muscle or bone. But the weariness was clean. It was the tiredness of something completed, not the exhaustion of something endured. "Vareth," Maren said as they walked back toward the 4th vault. "Yes." "The 10th vault. The red one, the one who was scared." "The fire class, what about it?" "I want to check on him before I start the evening rounds. I think he might eat something if I bring it warm enough." Vareth stopped walking. He turned and looked at her, at the gray kitchen tunic and the cloth-wrapped hair and the thermal container balanced on her hip, and the face of a woman who had just been named to the highest honor the oldest civilization in the galaxy could bestow, and whose first thought was to check on the one who had been frightened. He understood then what it was about humans that the Covenant had never accounted for. It was not their strength, or their ingenuity, or their capacity for survival in hostile environments. It was this, their inability to walk past something that needed them, not a philosophy, not a doctrine, not a trained response, just a reflex buried so deep in the species that they did not notice it themselves, the automatic, unthinking turn toward whatever was cold, whatever was hungry, whatever was alone. The galaxy had spent millennia building systems to manage power treaties, covenants, hierarchies, protocols. And here was a species that managed it with soup. "I will come with you," Vareth said. The vaults hummed, the stone was warm. And somewhere in the deep, Urvithon the Stone Mother settled her head against the floor where a blanket smelled like grain broth and human kindness, and slept the first true sleep of her life, not the sealed dormancy of a covenant that feared her, but the peaceful rest of a being who knew, at last, that someone was there. Maren went back to work. She had 17 mouths to feed, and the broth was getting cold.